In this lecture, we'll create the error handler Lambda. To do that, right click on the package, new class, call it error handler, and the package is s3sns.errorhandling is the package. Finish. This is the Lambda function that will be triggered by the dead letter Q event onto SNS. So SNS is the one which triggers this Lambda. Public void handler method. It receives a SNS event. We'll simply log that event out. There will be multiple records in this event. We will either use system.out.println or we can get the logger itself since we have everything configured. Logger factory.get logger. The class is ErrorHandler.class. Assign this to a local variable. Logger, or we'll stream through the events. Event.get records dot for each record Lambda function logger.info, however you want to log it, logger.info. The message here is dead within double quotes dead letter Q event. You can get rid of the extra T there, plus the record dot toString. That will display the entire record, which will have a lot of information in it. When we test it, we'll see what comes out of this. Let me take out that semicolon there. So very simple logic, error handler Lambda that will be triggered by SNS. We are handling the SNS event and we are logging whatever comes through that SNS event. And go to the patient checkout Lambda. Here, when the exception is thrown, if you simply catch that exception, right here we are already catching that exception and logging it to the log files or CloudWatch logs. If we do that, there is nothing that the Lambda service is going to do because we are handling the exception. So we need to throw this exception out. Once we log it, wrap it around a runtime exception and throw it so that the Lambda environment knows that there is something wrong that went and it will trigger or it will use the dead letter Q. So new runtime exception, you can pass in a message or simply pass in whatever exception was thrown. If you want, you can append a string here as well. You can say error while processing S3 event, comma, the exception itself. So in this lecture, you have created the error handler Lambda function, and also you have made a change in the patient checkout Lambda to throw the exception to let the Lambda environment know that something wrong went here and it should use the dead letter Q at some point.